A spool of linen thread sits on a table. Not a stage photograph, not a prop. A real spool, worn at the edges, the kind you find at a fishing village in southern Italy where the wood of the table has absorbed decades of salt air and the thread itself has a specific weight in the hand. Coarse, resistant, slightly waxy from the resin, they work into it along the Salento coast. And beside it, a pair of hands. Old hands. A man in his 90s, maybe older. Moving without hurry. The way people move when time stopped being an opponent somewhere around their 7th decade. Now, cut to a laboratory. Any laboratory. Pick one from the last 5 years. The fluorescent lights, the centrifuge spinning, the printouts of biomarker panels. The researchers with their 14 variables and their controlled sample sizes and their extraordinary machines that can read the age of a cell down to the month. Those two images, hold them together for a second. The hands in the lab. Because here is the thing nobody in that lab has been able to fully explain. The village those hands belong to, Acciaroli, a coastal town in the Campania region of southern Italy, population barely over 1,000, has one of the highest concentrations of centenarians on Earth. Not comparable to the famous longevity zones you've already heard about. Different, tighter, more specific, and, until recently, almost entirely ignored by mainstream research. A 2016 study out of the University of Rome La Sapienza and UC San Diego briefly put Acciaroli on the scientific map, noting that roughly 1 in 10 residents was over 100 years old. That ratio landed on researchers like a door that wouldn't open. In a country where the national average for centenarians runs around 0.02% of the population, Acciaroli was running at something closer to 10%. The statistics didn't fit any known model, and then the data went quiet for several years. The researchers moved on to more fundamental questions. The village kept doing what the village does. But this year, new Italian demographic data, drawn from civil registry records, regional health databases, and a longitudinal tracking project run out of the University of Salerno, has reopened the question with a clarity the 2016 paper couldn't carry. Because the numbers haven't declined. If anything, they've concentrated. The pattern of extreme longevity in this small stretch of the Salento coastline has not only persisted, it appears to be deepening across generations, which is the part that changes the theoretical framework entirely. If it were purely genetic, the pattern would dilute over time as people move, marry outside the region, change their habits. It hasn't diluted, which means something in the environment, the physical environment, the social structure, the daily rhythms, something that operates below the level of conscious decision-making, is doing something to the human body that the most sophisticated longevity labs on the planet are still trying to isolate in controlled conditions. The rosemary comes down off the hillside in the afternoon heat. You can smell it from here, dry and resinous, carried on the same air those hands have been breathing for 9 decades. The hands are still moving. The thread is still being worked. And this is where the data points towards something the control trials have not yet built a methodology to test. That the body is not a closed system running on inputs and outputs. It is a field. It responds to frequency, to the emotional charge of the environment around it, to the vibrational quality of the life being lived inside it. What the researchers are measuring in Acciaroli as biomarkers and ratios, the older frameworks would have called coherence. alignment, the condition that arises when a person's inner state and outer life are no longer in conflict. The law of vibration is not a metaphor. It is a description of what physics already confirms and what medicine is slowly being forced to account for. That matter organizes itself in response to energy, and that the energy a human being habitually generates through thought, through feeling, through the quality of attention brought to a spool of thread on a salt-worn table, is not decorative, is structural. Those hands are not just old, they are ordered, and the life that ordered them is the answer the laboratory is still trying to find. The hands already gave you the answer, not the data, not the graphs. The hands, calloused, unhurried, moving through a kitchen in the dark before anyone else in the village was awake. Those hands knew something that the laboratories have been trying to catch up to ever since. Call it habit, call it ritual, call it something that never needed a name because it was never in danger of being forgotten. That's what those hands carried. Not longevity as a goal. Longevity as a residue of a particular way of being inside a day. Now here's what the Italian data is actually saying, and it changes things. The study came out of a joint effort between the University of Bologna and a longitudinal registry team tracking population health across 14 Italian provinces. Not Sardinia, not the coastal villages everyone already knows, not the places that have been photographed and written about and turned into documentaries with slow-motion footage of old men walking between olive trees. Different provinces, inland, some of them post-industrial, some of them dealing with the same economic contractions that have hollowed out parts of the American Midwest, the kind of places that never made any longevity researcher's shortlist. And yet, the data shows a statistically significant cluster of what the researchers are calling functional centenarians. People reaching 95, 100, sometimes beyond, with preserved cognitive function, preserved physical independence, and inflammatory biomarker profiles that look on paper like someone 30 years younger. Not a handful of outliers, a replicable pattern, distributed across areas that share no single dietary tradition, no shared genetic lineage specific enough to explain it, no coastline, no centuries-old olive oil press, no postcard mythology. This is not an anomaly. The researchers were careful about that word. Anomaly implies error. This isn't error. It's replication in unfamiliar territory. The smell of old stone in the morning. The particular cold breath that comes off a building that has absorbed 400 winters is present in some of these villages. It's the kind of cold that doesn't apologize for itself. It just arrives, and you adjust to it, or you don't. The people who live inside it for decades seem to have reached a different relationship with adjustment itself. That might be the detail worth holding, because here is what the Bologna team is grappling with, and what makes this finding genuinely disruptive rather than just interesting. The original Blue Zone framework, Buettner's work, the National Geographic designation, all of it was built on the assumption that extreme longevity was, at least in part, a product of place. That the geography itself was doing something. The soil mineral content, the altitude, the proximity to sea air carrying specific particulates, the water. These weren't fringe theories. They were serious hypotheses backed by serious people, and they gave the whole field a kind of geographic determinism that felt for a long time almost reassuring. You couldn't replicate it, but at least you could explain why you couldn't replicate it. The new data doesn't destroy that framework. It complicates it in a way that's harder to dismiss. Because if the phenomenon can appear in a post-industrial province in Emilia-Romagna, if it can take root in a place with no special soil, no blue zone designation, no ancient maritime diet, then the geography was never the whole story. Maybe it wasn't even most of the story. There's a researcher in Bologna, one of the co-authors, who gave an interview to an Italian science journal that was later picked up in translation by a small medical newsletter. She said something that didn't make the abstract. She said, "We kept looking for what these new clusters had in common with the known blue zones, and we kept finding the same thing. It wasn't diet. It wasn't climate. It was something about the texture of daily life that we don't yet have clean language for." She used the Italian word tessitura, which translates roughly as weave, the weave of daily life. The particular way that small routines, social contact, physical movement, rest, and sensory engagement were threaded together, not optimized, not scheduled, not tracked, just woven. That word is doing a lot of work in this conversation, and it should be, because what she's describing isn't a protocol. It isn't a supplement stack. It isn't an intervention. It's something closer to a sustained frequency, a chronic internal environment that the body inhabits across decades, not weeks. And the body, apparently, takes its instructions from that environment more than from any single input. Not the acute signals, not the dramatic events, the background signal, the one that runs beneath everything else, steady and unannounced, like breath. Fear versus safety, urgency versus continuity, scarcity versus sufficiency. The body doesn't read these as feelings. It reads them as chemistry, and it makes long-term architectural decisions based on what the chemistry keeps saying. Longevity, at its most extreme, appears to be one of those decisions. The biology follows the pattern. The body reflects what it lives inside of, across enough years that the difference becomes visible in a biomarker profile that looks 3 decades younger than the calendar says it should. That's what the Bologna data is pointing at, whether or not the researchers use that language. What they found in the new Italian clusters, across the 14 provinces, in the aggregate data of 847 people aged 95 or older, was not a single shared variable in the conventional sense. No single food, no single genetic marker that hadn't already been found elsewhere without producing the same result. What they found was a profile, a suite of overlapping conditions, none of which was sufficient alone, all of which appeared together in the people who were still functioning, still present, still themselves at 100. Regular low-intensity physical movement integrated into daily necessity rather than performed as exercise. The kind of movement that doesn't announce itself, that happens because the day requires it, in kitchens and on streets worn smooth by the same feet for 60 years. Dense, frequent social contact that was reciprocal, not passive attendance at gatherings, but actual mutual interdependence, where people were needed as much as they needed others. A consistent relationship with sleep that wasn't medicalized or tracked, but was simply protected by the rhythm of the day. And something the researchers coded, somewhat awkwardly, as low ambient urgency, a phrase they acknowledge is not scientifically precise, but which appeared consistently enough in the qualitative interviews that they included it anyway. Low ambient urgency, the absence of chronic rush, not the absence of difficulty. These weren't easy lives, many of them, but the absence of a particular internal pressure that treats every moment as a problem to be solved before the next one arrives. That's the weave. That's the tessitura. And it's appearing reproducibly in places where no one was looking for it. The weight of this finding is not in the numbers alone, though the numbers are significant. The weight is in what the finding implies about the nature of the phenomenon itself. If extreme longevity were truly place-dependent, it would be an inheritance, a lucky accident of geography and ancestry. You either lived there or you didn't, and if you didn't, the conversation wasn't really for you. But if it moves, if it appears in new soil, in new provinces, in populations with no genetic overlap with the original clusters, then it's not an inheritance. It's a transmission, and transmissions travel through something. The question that the Bologna team is sitting with, the one they raise in the final paragraph of the paper and then leave open, is the one that will define the next decade of longevity research. They've established that the phenomenon replicates. They haven't established the mechanism of the replication. They know it's spreading. They don't yet know what it's moving through. If extreme longevity is no longer tied to a place, if it has been found surviving in soil that was never supposed to grow it, then something invisible is carrying it forward. And whatever that force is, it was never the geography. It was always something the body was doing quietly, in the dark, long before anyone thought to measure it. The year was 2004, and Michel Paulin was doing something that would later seem almost quaint, drawing a circle with a blue ballpoint pen around a cluster of villages in the Barbagia region of Sardinia. He and his collaborator Johnny P.S. had spent months working through demographic records, cross-referencing birth dates against death certificates, checking and rechecking a pattern that kept refusing to disappear. The pattern was this. Men in these villages were reaching 100 at a rate that made no statistical sense when measured against any comparable population. Not women only, which would have been less surprising. Men, shepherds, people who had worked hard physical lives, eaten simply, and remained without any particular intention, embedded in communities where you knew who your neighbors were because you had known their parents. Paulin drew the pen around the cluster. Someone in the group said the ink was blue. The name stuck. And for the next 20 years, what that pen circle touched off changed how the Western world thought about the upper limit of a human life. That is the event worth sitting with before anything else. Not the media cycle it produced. Not the wellness industry that eventually licensed the branding. The event itself. Two researchers in a field they had spent their careers in, encountering something the existing models could not account for, and choosing to document it honestly rather than explain it away. That choice matters, because the thing they documented was real. The experimental gerontology paper that followed was not theatrical science. The numbers were not soft. The men were genuinely old, and the life around them, the steep terrain walked daily, the meals eaten communally, the absence of what researchers would later call time pressure, the chronic background hum of running perpetually late for a life accelerating away from you. None of it had been designed. It had simply not been dismantled. Here is where honesty gets uncomfortable and where it gets personal if you let it. The Blue Zones model worked so well as a communication device that it gradually replaced the phenomenon it was describing. Publishers printed it. Television made it visual. corporations licensed it to retrofit American cities. Bike lanes, salad bars and cafeterias, walking paths, smoke-free ordinances, earnest, careful work, and some outcomes improved. But the centenarian clusters did not appear. The thing being chased did not show up in the redesigned spaces, because the thing being chased was not in the spaces to begin with. It was in the people. And here is the question that has probably been sitting somewhere in the back of your thinking since the last chapter. If you cannot build a blue zone around yourself, if you live in a city, work under pressure, have never eaten from a monoculture diet in your life, does the potential those villages were expressing belong to you? Or was it always only for them? That question is not rhetorical. It is the reason the new Italian data is worth your attention. The findings coming out of Lombardy, Emilia-Romagna, and Tuscany over recent years document pockets of exceptional longevity forming in environments the original Blue Zones model would never have predicted. Industrial cities, mixed diet populations, high-stress economic histories, people who smoked for decades, whose work lives bore no resemblance to the slow-rhythm pastoral existence that researchers filmed and photographed and turned into documentary television. The data is still being processed. The interpretations are not settled, but the pattern refuses to go away. Something is happening to human longevity that is not dependent on the conditions the last 40 years told us were necessary. Stand for a moment in a Bolognese apartment building in January. The cold there is specific, dense, slightly mineral, the kind that settles into the stairwell and stays all day regardless of what you do with the radiators. Nothing about that building looks like Okinawa. The bread on the table is different. The pace of the street outside is different. The history of the body that woke up there is different. And yet the numbers from certain streets in that city are doing the same remarkable thing the Sardinia numbers did. And they're doing it in people who followed none of the exported behaviors. Which means the Blue Zones model captured something real and simultaneously misread what it had captured. Social cohesion is not primarily a behavior. It is a biological state that behaviors make more likely. When you are genuinely embedded in a community, not as a wellness practice, not as a scheduled obligation, but as an unchosen, unremarkable fact of daily existence, your nervous system operates differently at the cellular level. Work from the University of Chicago has documented that social pain and physical pain share overlapping neural architecture. Research from the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences shows that perceived social integration measurably alters immune response markers. The connection is physiological, not metaphorical. But the Blue Zones model couldn't convey this because it was translating a state into an action. Join a community became the instruction. The internal environment that belonging creates, what your body does quietly and continuously when it knows it is not alone, that did not fit on a checklist. And you cannot checklist your way into a nervous system that feels safe. Natural movement was similarly misread when it became a prescription. The elderly Sardinian shepherd who walked steep terrain daily was not executing a movement protocol. His body was inside a life that required it to remain competent, and it responded to that requirement with a different set of cellular maintenance signals than a body that moves because a wearable device registered insufficient steps. A 2019 longitudinal study from the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences tracking motivation type in physical activity across 15 years, found that intrinsically motivated movement was associated with meaningfully different biomarker profiles than identical movement performed under external obligation. Same miles, different chemistry. The body is not just counting distance. It is registering meaning. Here is what the law of vibration framework would call this, and why it belongs in this conversation rather than a different one. The internal environment you're operating from, the frequency, the emotional register, the felt sense of whether your life is something happening to you or something you're genuinely inside. That environment is not a side effect of longevity. It may be the mechanism. What blue zones, geography, diet, and social structure were doing was lowering resistance to a certain biological expression. They were not creating it. They were stopping the interference long enough for it to occur. The Sardinian shepherd was not attracting health through intention, but he was also not vibrating at the cellular level, at the frequency of a man who believes his best years are behind him and his body is a problem to be managed. The law of attraction version of this is simpler than most people allow. You move toward what you're already internally organized around. The villages organized people internally without asking them to think about it. The Italian data is suggesting some people are getting there anyway. That lands differently depending on where you are right now. If you have been running hard for 20 years and the body is showing it, that may feel like too much to believe. That feeling deserves respect. But it is also worth noticing that the feeling itself, the sense that the gap is too large, is part of what gets measured when researchers look at perceived stress load and biological age. Your response to this information is not separate from your biology. It is participating in it. The blue zones were revealing a potential. They were not creating it. And if people with none of the traditional conditions are arriving at the same destination anyway, then the potential was never locked inside a particular geography. It was always in the person, including the person reading this, in whatever temperature the room happens to be right now, in whatever city, with whatever history the body is carrying. The mechanism is not gone. The question is what has been running interference with it, and what changes when the interference quiets. That is not a void to fall into. That is an open door. Here is something that has been sitting underneath every blue zone study ever published, every longevity headline you have ever scrolled past, every Mediterranean diet recommendation your doctor half mentioned and you half followed. It was there the whole time. Not hidden exactly, more like standing in plain sight while everyone kept looking just past it. The behaviors were real. The correlations were real. The people in Sardinia and Okinawa and Ikaria were genuinely living longer, genuinely moving more, eating differently, gathering with each other in ways that the rest of the modern world largely stopped doing. None of that was invented. The error was not in the observation. The error was in what the researchers concluded the observation meant. They saw what long-lived people did, and they decided that was the story. It was not the story. It was the shadow of the story. There is a region in the Apennine foothills, southeast of Bologna. The kind of place where the morning cold settles into your wrist before the sun clears the ridge, where the walls of the older buildings are the color of dried mustard, where the roads are narrow and cracked in ways that nobody is ever quite getting around to fixing. Not a postcard village, not a place any research team designated or filmed or packaged into a documentary. No name you would recognize. Researchers at the University of Bologna spent the better part of several years tracking population-level aging data across this region and others like it scattered through northern and central Italy. They were not looking to overturn anything. They were trying to confirm what was already believed, to validate the behavioral markers in non-blue zone populations. Standard work, the kind of project that usually produces exactly what it expects to produce. That is not what happened. The people living longest in these undesignated communities were not following any protocol you would recognize. Several of them drank. A few still smoked the way certain older Europeans smoke. Not often, not anxiously, just occasionally, and without the particular guilt that might itself be doing something to the body. Their step counts were ordinary. Their sleep was normal, not optimized. There was no discipline here, no system, nothing the wellness industry would invoice you for. And yet, when the researchers cross-referenced the behavioral data against biological age, grip strength over time, inflammatory markers from longitudinal blood draws, cognitive retention across the cohort, what came back was a divergence that the lead epidemiologist described, in their own language, as difficult to explain within existing models. The long-lived individuals were aging more slowly by every measurable biological standard, without doing the things longevity science had spent decades treating as the mechanism. You need to sit with what that means. Because if the behaviors are not the mechanism, then everything constructed on the assumption that there has been built on an effect, not a cause, an effect. 40 years of research, and the field was studying the exhaust and calling it the engine. Here is what the wellness industry then did with those 40 years. It took the behaviors of long-lived populations, stripped them out of context, repackaged them as instructions, sold them back to you, and when they did not work consistently, and they do not work consistently at scale, you already know this, you may have lived this. The explanation offered was that you were doing them imperfectly, not committed enough, not consistent enough. The failure was always located in you. The possibility that the behaviors were downstream of something else, that the Mediterranean diet was not producing the longevity, but was being produced by the same internal condition that was simultaneously producing the longevity. That possibility was inconvenient for every institution that had staked its credibility on the behavioral model. So it stayed largely unasked. The Bologna researchers, when the behavioral markers failed to differentiate their long-lived cohort from shorter-lived controls in the same communities, went looking for what these people actually shared. What came back was not a new list of behaviors. It was something harder to quantify, what the researchers cautiously described as a particular resting state of the organism. Not mysticism. These were epidemiologists. What they meant was specific and measurable. Lower baseline activation of stress response physiology. A pattern across self-reported experience, heart rate variability data from wearable subsets, and inflammatory marker clustering that pointed towards something operating beneath the level of behavior. A chronic biological resting state that was simply different from the controls. Not occasionally different, chronically, constitutively different. You can change your diet. You gotta walk. You can restructure your evening. You cannot change your resting state with a shopping list. That bowl being set down on a stone counter in the kitchen of a house that smells of wood smoke and old limestone. That is not a longevity intervention, but something in a person who hears that sound without their nervous system registering threat, without the low-grade biological alarm that most people in a modern world are simply living inside of without realizing it. Something in that person is already different at the level of cellular aging. Not because of the sound, because of the state. This is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable if you have spent years following the instructions and wondering why the results kept being inconsistent. Because the instruction set was never aimed at the right variable. And here is where it connects to something the research is now only beginning to approach with the language it deserves. What the Bologna data is pointing toward, what several converging lines of evidence are pointing toward, from psychoneuroimmunology, from epigenetics, from the study of biological age versus chronological age, is that the fundamental variable is vibrational in the most literal physiological sense. The state of the organism, the frequency at which the whole system is operating. And what regulates that state is not primarily what you eat or how many steps you take. What regulates that state is what you predominantly feel, what you predominantly expect, what your nervous system has learned through years of experience to anticipate as the baseline texture of being alive. This is the law of vibration, not metaphor, the operating condition of the biological system. And it connects directly to what you may already know as the law of attraction, because these two laws are not separate ideas. They're the same mechanism described from two different angles. Your dominant state of being is the signal you are broadcasting and the filter through which you receive. Change the state, and you change what the body does, what it ages into, what it draws toward itself. The behavioral markers, the blue zone, researchers cataloged were real. They were just downstream of this. The diet, the movement, the community, the sense of purpose. These are the natural expression of organisms already operating at a different baseline. Copy the expression without changing the baseline, and you're doing theater. Earnest, expensive theater. This is not a reason for despair. It is the most clarifying thing the research has produced in a generation. Because a shopping list is hard to sustain forever. A state of being, once you understand what it is and how it actually shifts, is something you carry everywhere. It does not require a particular geography. It does not require Sardinia. It does not require anything except understanding what you are actually working with. You have always been working with this. You just may not have had the language for it yet. There is a variable that decades of longevity research never put in the equation. Not diet, not genetics, not altitude or the mineral content of local water or the olive oil or the napping habits that get cited every time someone in a documentary smiles at the camera from behind a century of living. Something the spreadsheets had no column for, and that the epidemiologists at the University of Calabria spent nearly a decade not quite knowing what to call. The variable is time, not the amount of it, the relationship to it. And before that sounds like the opening of a wellness retreat brochure. Stay with it, because what the data actually shows is stranger and more specific than that framing suggests. Stand in a town in the interior of Calabria on a weekday morning. The light comes in low and sideways off the hills, the kind of light that makes even concrete look warm. The streets smell like diesel and bread and something older, stone that has been rained on for centuries. The bars are open. The old men are already there, not killing time, not waiting for anything in particular, just occupying the hour with a completeness that is easy to miss if you're moving at a different pace. This is the landscape the researchers walked into when they began cross-referencing their longevity outlier data. Individuals reaching 95, 100, 102 in regions outside the historically documented clusters. They did what researchers do first. They looked for the obvious: diet logs, medical histories, family trees going back 3 generations, physical activity levels measured and estimated, sleep, social network density, alcohol consumption, which in southern Italian communities is its own complicated variable. What they found in those external markers was statistically unremarkable. These individuals were not eating dramatically better than their neighbors who died at 78. They were not exercising with more discipline. Their family histories were not consistently cleaner. Some of these towns had poorer air quality than adjacent areas. Some had higher rates of tobacco use in the population at large. The soil, the sun, the food culture, the poverty rates, in some cases severe generational poverty, offered no particular longevity advantage. And yet the outliers kept appearing. When the team moved from the quantitative data to the qualitative interviews, long, unhurried conversations conducted in local dialect with these individuals and the people who lived and worked alongside them, a pattern began to surface that the spreadsheets couldn't touch. The researchers described it in their working notes with a phrase that resisted clean translation: un certo modo di stare nel tempo. A certain way of being inside time, not managing time, not optimizing it, not even savoring it in the way that wellness language would reach for. Something quieter, something that looked from the outside less like a practice and more like a posture. There is a difference, and this is where the chapter needs to slow down, because the difference is subtle, and the subtlety is everything. There's a difference between a person who is doing what they're doing and a person who is present to what they're doing. Not mindful in the branded, abstract sense of the word. Not performing presence for any audience, including themselves. Simply here, fully here, not rehearsing the next thing, not processing the last thing, not living in the 10 seconds ahead of the current moment as a way of managing the current moment. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, and it would be, except for the fact that it appears to be vanishingly rare, and the evidence now suggests it may be one of the most biologically consequential states a human organism can inhabit. The researchers at Calabria noted it in the texture of the interviews themselves. These individuals answered questions without apparent hurry, not because they were slow or cognitively dulled or indifferent, but because they seemed to be fully inside the question before they answered it. There was no performance of certainty, no reaching for the correct response. Just an unhurried occupation of the present exchange, as if the conversation was the only thing happening in the world. One of the researchers wrote in a marginal note, asterisk, they do not seem to experience time as something they are running against. Asterisk, in Cosenza, in the interior hills of Calabria, a woman named Concetta was interviewed at 97. She still kept a small kitchen garden. Not because she needed to, but because, as she put it, the dirt under the fingernails in the early morning was the best part of the day. The cold of the soil before the sun hit it. The way the tomato plants smelled like green iron. When asked about her age, she was briefly confused by the question. Not the number, she knew the number. Confused by the implication that the number was the interesting part. She had no protocol. She had no philosophy she could articulate. She slept when she was tired. She ate what she had. She worked in the garden because she liked the garden. She did not appear to regard her own longevity as an achievement. She appeared to regard each morning as a thing that had arrived, and she was attending to it. The researchers noted that this was not passive fatalism. She was sharp, opinionated, occasionally caustic. She had opinions about politics, about her neighbors, about the quality of this year's tomatoes versus last year's. She was engaged with the world, but her engagement had a quality they kept struggling to name until one of the team members, a woman from Genoa who had spent 2 years studying phenomenology before switching to epidemiology, wrote in the share report, asterisk, she is not behind herself. She is not ahead of herself. She is exactly where she is. Asterisk, this pattern, this modo di stare, appeared consistently across the outlier interviews. Not in every case, not with perfect uniformity, but with enough regularity that it could no longer be treated as anecdote. And here is where the data becomes genuinely strange. Because when the researchers began looking for the mechanism, the biological bridge between this quality of presence and the extended health span, they found themselves drawn toward work being done in a completely different country, in a completely different research tradition. A group at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin had been running a long-term study on what they called temporal self-location, the degree to which individuals habitually situate their cognitive and emotional attention in the present moment versus the anticipated future or rehearsed past. They were not studying longevity. They were studying decision-making and cognitive flexibility in aging populations. But buried in their longitudinal data was something the longevity researchers recognized immediately. The individuals with the highest scores on present moment temporal self-location showed measurably different inflammatory profiles at follow-up. Lower interleukin-6, lower C-reactive protein, not dramatically lower in every case, but consistently, reproducibly lower in a pattern that had nothing to do with diet, nothing to do with exercise frequency, and nothing that correlated cleanly with socioeconomic status or medical care access. The inflammation was quieter, and quieter inflammation, sustained over decades, is not a small thing. It is the difference between a body that is constantly fighting itself and a body that has found some kind of internal ceasefire. The fundamental variable that decades of longevity research never put in the equation was not a nutrient. It was not a gene variant. It was not a behavioral protocol that could be prescribed and tracked. It was the quality of attention a person brings to their own existence, moment by moment, over a lifetime, attention in the most biological sense. The state of the nervous system that underlies every other system in the body. Whether that system is running in the register of threat anticipation and temporal displacement, always scanning ahead, always processing the unfinished, or whether it is capable of genuine arrival in the present moment, which is the only moment in which the body's repair and maintenance functions fully operate. The body does not repair itself in the future. It does not regenerate in memory. Every cellular process that contributes to health span, the quiet work of protein clearance, vascular maintenance, immune regulation, happens now, in the present, in a body that is, at least sometimes, not braced against what's coming. The outliers in Calabria weren't living longer because they had cracked a code. They were living longer because they had never quite accepted the premise that time was their adversary. Conchetta, in her garden at dawn, fingers in cold soil, smelling that green iron smell, not thinking about tomorrow's weather or last year's harvest. She was not practicing anything. She was just there. And it turns out that being just there over a lifetime is a profound biological act. The body registers it. The inflammation registers it. The decades register it. That is not a small thing to sit with. There is a particular quality to the light in a small town in Calabria at around 2 in the afternoon. Not the bright, aggressive light of mid-morning, not the golden softening of late afternoon. It is a flat, white, almost indifferent light, the kind that presses down on the stones and makes everything slow. The dogs move to the shade, the shutters close, and the old men and women who live there, some of them in their 90s, some past 100, do something that most of the developed world has quietly forgotten how to do. They stop, not because they are tired, not because they have finished their work, but because stopping is, for them, a category of living, not a pause between tasks, not recovery in service of the next effort, just stopping. The white light presses down, the shutters close. The bread from lunch is still faintly warm in the stomach. The ethnographic record from the Italian longevity research, the interviews, the field observations, the transcript from teams who spent weeks inside these communities in Salento, in parts of Calabria, in pockets of Campania that the epidemiologists have now marked on their maps as statistical anomalies. That record contains something that will not fit into any chart a researcher can publish in a peer-reviewed journal. It is not a biomarker. It is not a dietary pattern, a sleep metric, or a step count. It is a relationship these people have with the present moment of their own days. And it is so foreign to the way most of us in this country currently live that the researchers who encountered it consistently noted it in their field observations, almost apologetically, as if they weren't sure what category to file it under. One interview that appears in the ethnographic appendix of a longitudinal study out of the University of Bologna, part of their broader work on the so-called Italian demographic exceptions, describes a 94-year-old woman named Giuseppina. She lives alone in a house with a small courtyard. She has no chronic diseases requiring daily medication. Her cognition, tested informally during the interview, is sharp. She is asked how she spends her days. She describes them with a kind of mild puzzlement at the question, as if the answer is obvious. She wakes when the light changes. She prepares food slowly. She eats with whoever comes. She rests in the afternoon. She sits outside when it is not too hot. She sleeps when it is dark. The researcher asks, and this is in the transcript, whether she ever worries about what is coming. About the future. Giuseppina considers this for a moment and says, essentially, the future has not arrived yet. Why would I be in a place I have not reached? The researcher writes, in the margin of the field notes, asterisk, she was not being philosophical. She appeared genuinely confused by the premise of the question. Asterisk. There is a moment described in those same field notes from a different visit, a different family, that is worth holding. A midday meal, 7 people around a table, 3 generations, a neighbor who stopped by, somebody's cousin who nobody could quite place. The meal had been cooking since mid-morning. The smell of it, fennel and something slow braised, had been moving through the house for 2 hours before anyone sat down. The meal itself lasted 90 minutes. Nobody checked a phone, not because phones were prohibited, not because the researchers had asked them to put devices away, simply because nothing about the social temperature of the table created any gravitational pull toward a screen. The conversation moved the way a fire moves, not efficiently, not toward any destination, but warmly, in whatever direction the air happened to carry it. An argument about whether someone's late uncle had been a good farmer. A long description of rain from 30 years ago. Laughter that came and went without anyone being the engine of it. When it ended the way things end when they have been given their full time. Not cut short, not extended past its natural boundary. Just done. Now here is what is worth saying clearly, because this is not a travel documentary, and this is not nostalgia for a simpler time. The researchers were not watching this and thinking, how charming. They were watching this and thinking, how is this physiologically possible? Because the data these same individuals produce, the inflammation panels, the cardiovascular markers, the cellular repair indicators, should not, by the models currently in use, be this clean. The bodies of people who eat bread and cured meat and drink local wine and do not own a gym membership should not, by prevailing nutritional epidemiology, produce these numbers. And yet they do, consistently, across geographies, across slightly different diets, across different levels of formal education, different income levels, different genetic backgrounds. The one variable that keeps appearing, not in the blood draws, but in the field notes, is this: these people do not experience their days as a resource to be managed. They do not wake up trying to extract maximum output from the hours ahead. They do not carry the low, grinding awareness that time is running out and the list is still long. They are not, as a cohort, haunted by what they did not do yesterday or bracing for what might go wrong tomorrow with anything like the intensity that characterizes the average American adult in their 50s. This is not because their lives have been easy. Many of them have survived loss, poverty, illness, war, and living memory. The women in these communities in particular have worked hard in ways that do not show up as wellness routines. They have not been sheltered from difficulty. What appears different is not the content of their lives, but the temporal grammar they use to inhabit them. The present tense, for them, is the primary tense. The past and future are visited, not lived in. The researchers from Bologna were careful not to romanticize this. They noted in the published discussion that this temporal orientation likely has roots in a pre-industrial relationship with time, that it is partly a cultural artifact, partly a product of slower-moving social environments, not something that can simply be prescribed. You cannot hand someone a protocol that says, live in the present tense for 90 minutes at lunch. But they also noted something that should not be dismissed as easily as we tend to dismiss things that don't come with a dosage. The physiological literature on anticipatory stress, the biology of what happens to a human body when it is chronically rehearsing future threats or replaying unresolved past events, is substantial and damning. The University of Pittsburgh's work on the relationship between rumination and systemic inflammation. The work done at Maastricht University on how the nervous system cannot biochemically distinguish between a present threat and a vividly imagined future one. The mechanism is not mysterious anymore. When a mind is chronically in another time, the body reads that as active danger. An active danger has a cellular cost that compounds quietly over decades. What these Italian elders appear to be doing is not a spiritual practice. It is not meditation, not mindfulness as a course you take. It is simply, and this is the strange part, the default, the resting state. The way they move through a Tuesday afternoon is the way a body moves through time when it is not, at baseline, afraid. And here is where the law of vibration stops being an abstraction and starts being a description of something measurable. Because what the physiological literature is documenting, the inflammation cascades, the cortisol patterns, the autonomic dysregulation that comes from a nervous system running chronic threat responses to events that have not happened and may never happen, is precisely what the law describes at the level of signal. The body is an emitter. What it emits continuously at the level of its chemistry, its electrical activity, its cellular behavior, is shaped by the dominant frequency of the mind operating it. A mind that lives primarily in anticipated loss or unresolved past injury is not a neutral instrument. It is a transmitter set to a frequency that the body then has to inhabit around the clock. The elders in Calabria are not doing anything that requires a course or a subscription. They are simply not running that signal. The present tense, inhabited without apology, produces a different frequency. And the bodies in the field notes, the clean panels, the cardiovascular elasticity, the cognition that should by the accepted timelines have started to fail, are the output of that signal held steadily over a very long time. This is not metaphor. The Pittsburgh data and the Maastricht data are not speaking loosely when they describe anticipatory stress as a physiological state. They're describing the body as a system that responds to what the mind transmits. The law is just the wider frame for what the cellular biology is already showing in the smaller one. For most of us who have lived any significant portion of adulthood in this country in this era, raising families through economic cycles that kept resetting, watching institutions corrode, feeling the specific weight of a world that delivers its bad news in real time, continuously at high volume, a resting state that is not at baseline. Afraid sounds less like a lifestyle choice and more like a description of someone who has not been paying attention. But the bodies in Calabria are there. The field notes are there. The 90-minute lunch with no phones and the afternoon that asks nothing of anyone is there, observable, documented. And the physiological outputs of those bodies are not a matter of interpretation. What that means practically, for someone who does not live in a small town in southern Italy, who has a mortgage and a phone and obligations that do not slow down in the afternoon, is the part that requires honesty rather than instruction. The signal can be changed, not all at once, not by deciding to feel differently about things that are genuinely hard. But the mechanism is real, it is not hidden, and the evidence of what it produces over time is sitting in those field notes in plain sight. That is not a small thing to know. The answer came slowly, not in a lab, not in a press release. It came the way most true things arrive, buried inside a question nobody thought to ask until the data made it unavoidable. The village of Acciaroli sits on a limestone cliff above the Tyrrhenian Sea in the Campania region of southern Italy. Not Sardinia. Different coast, different dialect, different light. In the afternoons, the air there carries stone, a kind of granular consistency that most longitudinal studies never sustain. Blood panels, inflammatory markers, cardiovascular imaging, the full picture. What they found should have been unremarkable. Old people in a small Italian village living long. We have heard that story. The problem is what the data actually said. One subject, a man well past his 100th year, had smoked for decades. Not occasionally, decades. His arterial walls, by standard clinical expectation, should have carried the cumulative signature of that. They did not. The imaging was, in the language the researchers used with careful restraint, surprising. Not extraordinary, surprising. That word was doing a lot of work. Another subject maintained a diet that would not survive a conversation with a mainstream nutritionist. High in salt, inconsistent in vegetables, not what the protocols prescribe. His inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, the standard indicators of the slow biological fire that underlies most age-related disease, were low. Measurably, consistently, puzzlingly low. You read those findings and you wait for the genetic explanation. A mutation, a rare variant, something that closes the gap and makes the anomaly behave. The Salerno team looked. The genetics did not deliver a clean answer. The findings pointed somewhere else, somewhere less comfortable for a discipline that has spent decades learning to look for molecular causes. The biology was not behaving as if it were running on the variables being measured. Sit with that for a second, because we are all trained, you, me, everyone who has spent any time in wellness culture, to treat the body as a ledger. Inputs on one side, outputs on the other. You smoke, the arteries pay. You eat poorly, the inflammation rises. That logic has been useful. It has saved lives. It is not wrong. But in Acciaroli, the ledger was not balancing. And this is not an isolated anomaly. The Salerno data is the most rigorously documented recent example, but the pattern appears elsewhere if you know how to read for it. Studies out of the University of Bologna have flagged similar discrepancies in healthy aging cohorts. Work published in the European Journal of Epidemiology, not a fringe outlet, has documented cases where predicted biological age, calculated from standard biomarker panels, diverges sharply from functional age in ways the panels themselves cannot account for. The researchers do not ignore this. They note it. They use words like unexplained variance, residual factors, confounding variables. Those are honest words. They are saying something is affecting the outcome that we have not put into the equation yet. The question is what that something is. The standard response to this kind of divergence is to go smaller, to look for the mechanism at a finer level of resolution. Maybe the microbiome, maybe epigenetic methylation patterns, maybe a protein we have not isolated yet. The scientific instinct is to zoom in, find the molecule, close the explanatory gap with more biochemistry. That instinct is not wrong. It is just incomplete, because what the Acciaroli data keeps quietly suggesting is that the body is responding to a variable the instruments are not designed to detect. Not a nutrient, not a genetic inheritance. Something else is in the room when these centenarians wake up each morning. Something the blood panels do not capture. The Salerno researchers interviewed these subjects. Not just measure them, talk to them. And certain patterns emerged in those conversations that never made it into the journal papers because there is no biomarker for them. The subjects described their relationship to daily life in terms that sounded, to a clinical ear, almost boring. Not enlightened, not mystical, boring. An unhurried engagement with the morning. A low tolerance for prolonged states of urgency. A practiced indifference to outcomes they could not control, paired with a focused attention to whatever was directly in front of them. The smell of bread in the oven, the weight of a glass in the hand, the specific quality of light coming through a particular window at a particular hour of the afternoon. That same salt and warm stone light you noticed when you first arrived in the village before you had time to think about it. Not techniques, not protocols, not habits cultivated for health reasons. Just the texture of being present in a body, in a place, without pushing against it. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually sit with it rather than move past it. How are you receiving what I just described? Because there are two ways to take that information, and which one you reach foretells you something important. One response is intellectual interest. You file it under fascinating anomaly. You note that presence and low urgency seem correlated with good outcomes, and you move on looking for the mechanism. That response is not wrong, but it keeps the information at arm's length, out there in Italy, happening to people who are not you. The other response is something closer to recognition, a quiet discomfort, the sense that you already know what the opposite of that Acciaroli morning feels like, the pushed quality of most days, the background hum of things unresolved, the way urgency has become so constant it stopped feeling like urgency and just started feeling like normal. If that lands somewhere specific for you, that is worth noticing. That is not a side point. That is the whole point. Here is what I think the data is actually telling us, stated plainly. The biological machinery is downstream of something. The body is not the primary system. And the centenarians of Acciaroli seem to have gotten the upstream thing right, often without trying, often while doing everything else wrong by the book. At some point in the second half of your life, you have probably noticed that effort and outcome stop correlating the way they used to. You could do everything correctly and still feel like the ground is slightly wrong underfoot. And you can meet someone who, by every measurable standard, should be worse off, and yet something about them is visibly more intact, more coherent, less spent. That coherence, that consistency of internal state, is what the Acciaroli subjects seem to have in common. Not a supplement, not a perfect diet, a particular quality of how they were organized inside, day after day, decade after decade. And the biology appears to have taken its cues from that. The researchers do not yet have an instrument for it. The literature keeps calling it unexplained variance, but is showing up too consistently in too many places to be noise. If that is real, and the evidence says it is real, then the question that follows is not comfortable. It is not, what do I add to my routine? It is, what is actually running in the background of how I move through a day? What state am I in most of the time without deciding to be in it? And is that state doing biological work I have never thought to account for? The data that gets into that question directly is not from Italy. It comes from a different kind of research entirely, and it makes what we covered here look like the easy part. That is where we are going. But before we get there, stay with the bread, the glass, the light through the window, not as a metaphor, as a question about how you are actually living. There is a village in the Salento region of southern Italy where the roads are too narrow for two cars to pass each other at the same time. Not by accident, by design, or at least by indifference to any other way of doing things. The stone walls on either side have been there longer than anyone living can remember, and they will be there after everyone currently breathing in that village is gone. That permanence has a smell to it. Old mortar, dry grass. The faint trace of something herbed and warm drifting from a kitchen window sometime around midday. Walk slowly enough and you can feel it settle on you. The place does not hurry. It has never hurried. And something about that unhurried quality, it turns out, is not incidental. What the epidemiologists found when they came to places like this was not what they expected to find. They brought their clipboards and their intake forms. They asked about diet. They asked about sleep duration. They measured resting heart rates and recorded family histories and checked for the obvious markers, the ones that appear in every longevity paper, the ones that get cited in every magazine piece about living to 100. They documented what these people ate. They noted that some of them drank wine and some of them didn't, and the ones who did often lived just as long as the ones who didn't. They found people who had never heard of supplement, and people who had never set foot in a gym, people who slept inconsistently, and people who had smoked for decades. And they found that none of that, not one variable on the standard checklist, fully explained what they were looking at. That was the open question this video left on the table several chapters ago. What is the missing variable? What is biology actually responding to if it isn't the protocol? The answer that came back from the data was uncomfortable for scientists trained to quantify things because it wasn't a thing. It was a quality, a texture of experience, something that resists a column header on a spreadsheet. The researchers at the Mario Negri Institute in Milan, one of Europe's oldest and most rigorous pharmacological research institutes, an organization not known for speculation, began looking at this problem from a different direction. Not what these people were doing, but what they were not doing. And what they were not doing chronically, persistently at the level of daily cellular function was resisting the present moment. That sounds like something off a meditation retreat brochure. It isn't. It is a measurable physiological state. The field is called psychoneuroimmunology, and it has been accumulating evidence since the 1970s. But what it can show now is different from what it could show then. When the body holds chronic psychological resistance, not the sharp, useful spike of acute stress, but the grinding, low-grade friction of a life that feels like it is happening against you, the gene expression changes. Not metaphorically, in the actual cellular machinery, in the proteins that read and transcribe DNA, in the pathways that govern how fast a cell ages and when it decides to stop replicating cleanly. The Mario Negri team's recent work, alongside parallel findings from the University of Pavia and a consortium studying what researchers now call the Salento anomaly, mapped something specific, genes associated with cellular aging, including those governing inflammatory cytokine production and mitochondrial repair, showed meaningfully different expression patterns in long-lived Salento populations compared to age-matched urban controls. Diet adjusted, exercise adjusted, sleep adjusted, the difference persisted. The smell of that old mortar, the pace of a road too narrow for urgency. Whatever those conditions were doing, they were doing it all the way down to the sequencing data. What varied was something harder to name. The Salento elders, when interviewed, described their days not as things they had accomplished, but as things they had moved through. There was a quality of non-urgency that was not laziness. These were people who worked hard, who had built things with their hands, who had known poverty and loss and illness. It was not the absence of difficulty. It was the absence of what one researcher's notes described as the sustained internal argument with circumstances. Think about what that means for a moment. Not the absence of hard days. The absence of the ongoing quarrel with the fact that the hard day is happening. That distinction is where the biology starts to diverge. There is a set of molecular switches, particularly sensitive to perceived threat states, running through pathways that regulate inflammation at the cellular level. They respond not to what is actually happening in the body, but to how the nervous system is interpreting its own situation. When a nervous system registers chronic unresolved conflict with a diagnosis, with a circumstance, with the simple grinding fact of a life that feels like resistance, those switches tip toward accelerated cellular aging. Cells do not require a physical injury to start aging faster. They require only a sustained signal that the environment is hostile and the hostility is not resolving. The Salento populations did not show that signal at the rates the research teams predicted for their age brackets. They showed the inflammatory profile of people who were, at a biological level, not fighting anything. Now, consider one woman in that data set, 104 years old at the time of the study. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived a son who died in his 50s. She sat in a chair in a room that smelled of the same herbs that drift from windows in that village every afternoon. And when the researchers asked her about her son, she did not look away. She did not perform composure. She simply answered. The grief was present in her face. It had not been dissolved or resolved into something cheerful. But what was absent, what the interviewers noted and could not quite categorize, was any quality of argument with the fact that it had happened. The loss was real. The resistance to the loss had not calcified around it. She was not carrying the quarrel. She was only carrying the memory. Her inflammatory markers told the same story her face did. That is a different thing than resilience in the way the word gets used now. The bounce back, the recovery, the return to function. This was something quieter, an absence of the chronic grip. And this is where what the Salento data describes starts to converge with something much older than the research. Because what the biology is measuring in a language of gene expression and cytokine profiles and mitochondrial integrity is the difference between a body that meets its own life and a body that refuses it. The habitual interior weather a person generates is not just a mood. It is a physiological environment, and that environment either accelerates or slows what the cells do next. Attraction follows as consequence, not as magic. A body operating from non-resistance does not just feel different, it selects differently. It notices different things. It responds differently to the same stimuli. The person who moves through a room without a background hum of unresolved threat perceives different options than the person carrying the same external circumstances but a different interior climate. This is not wishful thinking. It is the downstream effect of a nervous system that has stopped spending its operating budget on vigilance. The missing variable that no epidemiologist put in the column header was the chronic presence or absence of internal resistance, the degree to which the present moment is met or refused. And that variable is now showing up in the biology, not as self-report, not as questionnaire data about subjective well-being, but as sequencing data, as measurable differences in how the body is reading its own instructions. There is still a stone wall in the Salento that has been there for 400 years. Someone built it without modern tools, and it has simply remained because nothing came along to remove it. The people who live beside it now are some of the longest-lived human beings on the planet. The wall does not know why it is still standing. It simply never encountered sufficient reason to fall. The 104-year-old woman who did not look away, she is the wall. Not because nothing broke her, because she never built the secondary structure, the internal fortification against the fact of being broken. And that absence, that particular quietness, is written into her cells as legibly as anything a laboratory can read. Which means the question this chapter leaves you with is not about Italy, and it is not about someone else's data. It is about the hum running underneath your own day right now. Not the thoughts you can name, but the texture beneath them, the quality of how you're holding your own existence in this moment. Whether what you find there feels like meeting or like refusing, that answer is already shaping something. The biology does not wait for you to decide whether you believe it. There is a specific kind of person the researchers were not expecting to find. Not the smoker. Not the man who hasn't moved his body in a decade. Not the woman surviving on processed food and 4 hours of sleep. Those profiles were already in the literature, already predicted, already accounted for in the models. The person they were not expecting was the one who does almost everything right. A cluster of longitudinal studies tracking adults between 45 and 70, conducted across northern Italian provinces and replicated in cohorts in the Netherlands and Japan, began with a simple question about functional decline. Why do some people age at roughly the biological rate the science predicts, while others age measurably faster, even when the external variables look controlled? Diet logged, exercise recorded, sleep monitored, alcohol minimal, and yet the inflammatory markers in their blood told a different story than their habits should have produced. The air in those clinical rooms had a particular quality. Cool, slightly stale, the faint mineral trace of disinfectant mixed with something older in the walls. The kind of institutional smell that has absorbed decades of quiet work. The researchers looked at what they had, and the data pointed somewhere most biomedical frameworks were not equipped to go. The answer the data kept returning to was not what the participants consumed or how often they exercised. It was something about the texture of their attention, the quality of how they actually inhabited their days. Let me be precise about what that research actually showed, because the precision matters here. The teams were tracking a cluster of inflammatory biomarkers: interleukin-6 C-reactive protein, and a less commonly cited marker called GDF-15, which functions as a cellular stress signal the body secretes when tissues are operating under sustained strain. GDF-15 rises with injury, with infection, with metabolic disruption, but it also rises in a pattern correlated with something harder to measure: a chronic orientation toward the future characterized by low-grade anticipatory threat. Not diagnosed anxiety, not clinical depression, something more ambient than that, and far more common. The researchers described it carefully as a persistent activation of what they called anticipatory stress architecture. the body running the physiological equivalent of a threat scan on background, indefinitely because the mind has trained it to. The future is being treated by the nervous system as a space that requires constant defensive preparation. GDF-15 in those subjects was elevated, not dramatically, not in the range you would see with illness. Subtly, persistently, month over month, year over year, the signal did not return a baseline. And in the multi-year tracking windows, the gap between those subjects and their biological peers widened in ways that showed up clearly in functional testing. Grip strength, processing speed, vascular flexibility, immune response timing. The ones aging faster were not sick. They were, in a very specific physiological sense, always preparing to be. Here is where I want to turn this toward you. Not with accusation, because accusation is not what this moment calls for, but with a real question. Think about the last time you were fully, unguardedly present in a Wednesday afternoon. Not working towards something, not monitoring something, not running a quiet background calculation about what needs to happen, what might go wrong, what hasn't been resolved yet. Just there, in the room, tasting the coffee, hearing the birds outside, that particular sharp call of a bird you've never learned the name of but have heard in your yard for 15 years, the sound landing in your chest before your brain catches up. If that moment took effort to recall, that is not a flaw in your character. It is a description of what life at 45 plus tends to produce. A baseline forward lean that never fully stops, a habit of mental anticipation so ingrained it has stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like just the way things are. A physiological posture, an architecture, and this is where the law of vibration enters the picture, not as metaphor, but as mechanism. The nervous system is a frequency instrument before it is anything else. It does not wait for a threat to arrive before it begins calibrating toward one. It reads the signal being broadcast by your attentional habits and organizes the body accordingly. When the dominant signal is anticipatory, scanning, bracing, pre-solving, the body holds itself in the physiological equivalent of a door half open to danger. GDF-15 rises. Interleukin-6 stays activated. The immune system runs warm. The law of attraction, in this context, is not about positive thinking. It is about what the body is literally summoning through its sustained chemical state. A nervous system vibrating at chronic low-level threat is not neutral. It is recruiting biology to match that frequency. Month by month, year by year, it attracts, in the most material sense, the cellular outcomes that frequency produces. Here is the piece of the data that the research teams highlighted as the most unexpected finding, and it deserves a moment of genuine stillness. The correlation between what they called present moment attentional quality, measured through validated self-report instruments and cross-referenced with experience sampling data, and the rate of functional decline over the tracking period was stronger than the correlation with diet quality, stronger than exercise frequency, comparable in magnitude across the cohorts to the effect of smoking, comparable to smoking, not because distraction is chemically toxic the way cigarette tar is, but because the sustained inflammatory signal produced by chronic anticipatory stress, the background GDF-15 elevation, that persistent low-level immune activation, accumulates over years without fanfare, without drama, without a single moment you could point to and name as the turning point. until one day the reading on the test is different than it should be, and nobody can explain why, because all the visible variables looked fine. The research was careful not to frame this as a psychological failing. It was physiological, architectural. The body had been given a signal, repeatedly through patterns of attention and anticipation, and it had responded the only way a body knows how, by organizing itself around that signal. It organized itself for a threat that was always coming and never arrived. The subjects in these cohorts who showed the slowest functional decline, even when their diets were imperfect, even when their sleep was inconsistent, shared a specific pattern in their attentional data. They returned after the forward lean, after the planning and the anticipating and the bracing. They came back to the actual texture of the day in front of them. The warmth of afternoon light on a particular wall, the weight of a familiar chair, the exact give of its cushion under their hands, the smell of rain on concrete in a neighborhood they had walked through 1,000 times, the pavement holding that dark wetness that takes an hour to dry. That return, unremarkable from the outside, unchosen as a formal practice, simply habitual, appears in the data as one of the most consistent predictors of slower biological aging across the entire research record. This is what shifting your vibrational frequency actually looks like when it is stripped of ceremony. Not a retreat, not a protocol, not a morning ritual performed with deliberate gravity. It is the recurring, ordinary act of letting the present moment be real rather than preliminary. And when it becomes habitual, when the body begins to expect return rather than brace for threat, the inflammatory architecture starts to change. GDF-15 comes down. The immune system stops running warm. The door that was half open to danger begins, slowly, to close. You already know how to do this. You have done it in the yard, hearing that bird. You have done it holding something warm in both hands on a cold morning, the heat moving from the ceramic through your palms. You have done it without knowing it carried this kind of weight. The research simply confirms what the body already demonstrated, that where you place your attention is not a small thing. It is, over time, the thing. And the frequency you sustain across an ordinary Tuesday afternoon is doing biological work that no supplement, no optimized protocol, no perfectly logged meal can fully override. That is not a warning. That is an opening. You're already closer to this than you think. Researchers in Salento, a stretch of coastline in southern Italy that most people outside the country couldn't locate on a map, have been trying to explain something that keeps refusing to be explained by the usual variables. The Acciaroli study, conducted across a cluster of villages between Salerno and the Calabrian border, identified a population with an unusual concentration of people in their 90s and past 100 living without dementia, without the standard cardiovascular burden, with inflammatory markers that looked more like 50 than 90. The researchers came in expecting to find a dietary pattern, an olive oil story, a Mediterranean diet vindication they could publish cleanly. What they found was considerably harder to package. The diet was good, not exceptional. The movement was real, not remarkable. The thing that kept surfacing in the data and in the interviews and in the biomarker profiles was something that kept getting filed under stress resilience because there wasn't a better clinical category for it. The nervous systems of these people recovered faster. After difficulty, after disruption, after the ordinary friction of a life, They returned to baseline faster than comparative populations. Not because their lives had been easier. The Salento villages had been poor, isolated, shaped by the kind of post-war scarcity that doesn't leave clean. These are not people who had been spared. They were people whose bodies had learned to stop bracing. That finding has been sitting in the research literature without enough attention. This chapter is about what it actually means physically, measurably, in tissue and blood chemistry, and the electrical rhythm of a nervous system that has been running on alert for so long it forgot it had another mode. The mechanism begins at the vagus nerve. It runs from the brainstem down through the throat, past the lungs, coils around the heart, and reaches into the gut. Long, wandering, ancient. Most people, when they think about it at all, think about signals moving downward. The ones that matter most for what the Acciaroli data is describing are the ones moving up. The body sending dispatches to the brain about what it's actually doing, what it's sensing, what state it's in right now. When a person lives in chronic low-grade resistance, not crisis, not panic, but the constant lower register tension that 2024 and 2025 have refined to a kind of background frequency, the vagal tone degrades. High vagal tone means the system is flexible, capable of ramping down after a spike. Low vagal tone means the return is sluggish. The system fires and it stays slightly hot. Not hot enough to feel like emergency. Hot enough that the wrong baseline becomes invisible because it's been the only baseline for years. What changes the moment that resistance starts to loosen? Heart rate variability shifts. The intervals between heartbeats, which in a low vagal tone state cluster too closely together, begin to spread. Less metronomic, more variable, in the way that variability is actually the sign of health, not irregularity. Cardiologists at the University of Milan published work in Frontiers in Physiology showing that HRV changes precede mood shifts, not follow them. The body signals safety first. The mind follows the body's report, which means the physiological release is not a consequence of feeling better. It is the mechanism that produces it. There is warmth that comes with it. Peripheral vasodilation, the small blood vessels near the skin opening, circulation reaching places it had been rationing. Hands warm. The skin at the temples softens slightly. The jaw, which had been holding something for months without announcing itself, eases. 2 millimeters. Enough for a face to read differently. Enough for someone across a room to perceive something they can't name. Deeper in the tissue, the immune signaling changes. The University of Pittsburgh's brain, behavior, and immunity center has tracked what happens to interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha under sustained psychological resistance compared to states of acceptance. And these are not philosophical distinctions the researchers are drawing. IL-6 and TNF-alpha are pro-inflammatory cytokines. The immune system uses them to signal threat. In acute situations, they are genuinely useful, appropriately deployed. In states of chronic low-grade resistance, they stay elevated. Not high enough to trigger markers on a standard panel, high enough to age the arterial walls slowly, suppress mitochondrial efficiency, slow cognitive processing in ways that feel, to the person experiencing it, simply like getting older. When the resistance drops, those markers come down. Not all at once. The way a room cools after the heat source is removed. Within days and some studies. Within weeks consistently. The sleep architecture changes, and this is the one that surprises people. Not duration, composition. The proportion of slow-wave sleep, the deepest tier where cellular repair actually happens, increases. The glymphatic system, the brain's overnight waste clearance mechanism, driven primarily during slow-wave sleep, clears more efficiently. Researchers at the University of Rochester first mapped this process. Subsequent work has found it's exquisitely sensitive to the autonomic nervous system's state going into sleep. A body arriving at the pillow still carrying its low-grade resistance gets perhaps 60% of the glymphatic clearing it's capable of. A body that arrives with vagal tone restored gets something closer to what the system was designed to do. Old wood somewhere in a room. The ceiling that has been there for years, familiar enough that it stops being visible. The blanket settling into the body's shape, warm where the body is warm. That is the condition under which the brain actually cleans itself, not a metaphor. The sensory specificity of safety, recognizing it through texture, through temperature, through the smell that signals this place has not changed, is part of the mechanism. None of this requires a belief system. It requires only the reduction of one physiological posture. The chronic bracing that says no, not this, not now, this shouldn't be happening. That posture has a running cost. The Acciaroli data suggests the people who live into their 90s with clear cognition aren't the ones who avoided the difficulty that generates it. They're the ones whose nervous systems developed what the researchers call recovery speed. How quickly after activation does the system find its way back? That variable across the biomarker profiles in the Soleno study turned out to be more predictive of long-term health outcomes than nearly any single dietary factor they measured. There is something almost insulting in the simplicity. Decades of research into longevity. And one of the strongest signals is, how fast does your body stop reacting? The most direct access point anyone has to this system is the breath, and not as a relaxation technique which undersells it. Slow exhalation, longer than the inhale, directly activates the vagal brake, the cardioinhibitory fibers that pull the heart rate down. This is the same mechanism anesthesiologists use to monitor vagal response intraoperatively. Every extended exhale is a manual input, not to override the system, to remind it that the threat it thinks it's managing may not require full engagement right now. 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out. Not because the numbers are magic, because the ratio weights the exhale, and any ratio that does that will engage the mechanism. The body notices the proportion. It has been noticing it your entire life. What the Soleno populations appear to do, not through philosophy, not through wellness practice, but through the habitual rhythm of a particular kind of life, its slowness, its repetition, its orientation toward what is actually in front of them, is maintain a default return. The nervous system that returns quickly doesn't accumulate the inflammatory debt. The joints stay clearer longer. The cognition holds. The sleep does what sleep is supposed to do. This is what the data is describing when it says these people live long and think clearly. A nervous system that learned to stop bracing faster than average. And if the internal state can change all of this, the chemistry, the electrical tone, the immune signaling, the architecture of sleep, a question forms on its own without needing to be introduced. It arrives the way conclusions arrive, when the evidence has been laid out honestly and the implications haven't yet been named? If the internal state changes all of this inside the body, does what a person encounters outside it begin to change too? That question has been moving through this conversation since the beginning. The research on it is younger and more contested than what this chapter covers, but exists, and it points somewhere specific. There is a particular quality to afternoon light in the Salento region of southern Italy. Not the postcard brightness people expect. Something older. The light comes down through the valley at an angle that makes the stone walls of the villages look like they have been standing since before memory, and the air carries with it the faint mineral edge of the hillside. Limestone and dried herb, warm even in the shade. If you stood in one of those village squares on a weekday afternoon, you would notice that the oldest people there are not doing anything urgent. They're not performing calm. They're simply not agitated. There is a difference, and the body registers it before the mind names it. This is where the Italian data begins to clarify itself in ways that the epidemiological numbers cannot fully reach. The researchers who have spent the last several years tracking the extreme longevity clustering in southern Italy, particularly in the provinces of Salerno and Cosenza, noticed early on that the dietary and genetic variables, while meaningful, could not account for the gap they were measuring. These were not people eating a controlled diet. They ate what was available, what was affordable, what their grandmothers had made. Some of them smoked. Some of them drank. The standard risk factor model kept producing anomalies. Men and women in their 90s and past 100 whose blood panels were confounding. Not because everything was optimal, but because the markers of chronic systemic inflammation were, in study after study, strikingly low. And the researchers kept returning to the same question: what is different about how these people relate to time? Not what they do with time, how they relate to it. The answer that kept surfacing in the interview data. And this is a qualitative finding, which means it requires more caution, but it has proven consistent enough to be taken seriously. Was this: the centenarians of the Salento corridor do not appear to spend significant cognitive or emotional energy anticipating the worst. Not because they are naive, not because they have been sheltered from hardship. Most of them were born into poverty. Several lived through the Second World War in this region, which was not a distant abstraction, but a physical presence in these villages. They know what loss looks like. They have buried people they loved. And yet, when the interviewers asked them about the future, about illness, about death, the responses were almost uniformly characterized by a kind of factual calm. Not resignation, not the flattened effect of someone who has given up. Something more like the absence of a fight that was never going to be won by fighting. One woman, 102 years old at the time of the interview, described her approach to difficult news the way you might describe how you handle rain. You see it coming. You take note. You do not stand in it longer than you need to. You move inside. The researchers noted that none of these individuals reported practicing anything. No meditation, no gratitudinous, no structured breathing. What they practiced, insofar as it could be described as a practice at all, was the refusal to sustain imaginary catastrophe. When something bad happened, they engaged with it. When something bad had not happened yet and might not happen, they did not build it in advance and live inside the construction. This is not optimism. Optimism is a stance toward the future. What these people demonstrated is something closer to a structural absence, a gap where the catastrophic imagination would normally operate. And that gap, That quiet space where most modern minds generate noise appears to have measurable physiological consequences. The inflammation markers are consistent. The cognitive resilience measures are consistent. The allostatic load scores, the cumulative biological cost of perceived stress, are in this cohort consistently low in ways that age alone does not explain. Researchers studying these numbers from a biohacking framework noticed something that the longevity data alone couldn't surface. The interventions that most reliably move allostatic load scores in younger populations, cold exposure, structured fasting, targeted supplementation, they work, but they work downstream. They address the signal after it has already been generated. What the Salento cohort appeared to be doing was something further back in the chain, not managing the stress response after activation, not producing it in the first place. The body never received the invoice because the catastrophe was never built. Now here is where something that usually gets badly explained becomes worth explaining carefully. There is an idea older than its modern packaging, older than the books that turn it into a commercial genre, that the chronic frequency of your internal state and the distribution of what you actually encounter in the world are not independent variables, that they move together. This idea has been dressed up, sold hard, and in the process almost completely obscured. But strip the mythology away, and what remains is a mechanism, not a metaphor. When your nervous system is operating from a chronic baseline of anticipatory threat, scanning the horizon for what might go wrong, running low-grade simulations of disaster, your attentional system narrows. This is not psychology. This is basic survival architecture. A system in threat detection mode filters out information that is not relevant to the threat. It is efficient. It is also, over time, profoundly limiting, because what it filters out is opportunity, connection, anomaly, the slightly open door that was always there. You're not seeing less because you are pessimistic. You are seeing less because your visual and cognitive attention has been narrowed by design, optimized for a danger that, most of the time, is not actually present. When that baseline shifts, when a nervous system stops running the low-grade catastrophe simulation as its default, the attentional system opens. And what opens with it is access to a different slice of the same reality. Not a better reality, the same one, accessed differently, because the aperture is different, and a different aperture captures a genuinely different picture. This is the mechanism, not magical causation, not the universe rewarding positive feelings with favorable events. Something more mechanical than that, and more interesting. What your nervous system is habitually running determines what you can perceive, and what you can perceive determines what you reach for, and what you reach for determines what arrives. The law of vibration and the law of attraction, if you want to use those names, are pointing at this. Not at wishing, at the physics of a tuned system. A nervous system chronically tuned to threat vibrates at a frequency that the wider attentional field responds to accordingly. More threat-relevant data, less of everything else. The Salento-centenarians were not tuned that way. Not through practice, not through effort, through a structural habit cultivated across a lifetime of refusing to pre-live the disaster, which is why the biohacking angle matters here, and also where it reaches its limit. You can optimize the body's stress response from the outside in. Cold, fasting, breath work, load management. These are real tools with real data behind them. But they're working on the output of a signal that, if the internal frequency doesn't shift, keeps regenerating. The Salento data suggests that what looks like extraordinary biology in these centenarians may be, at least in part, the long-run physiological consequence of an extraordinarily quiet signal. Not silence, not avoidance. The specific quiet of a mind that meets what is actually happening and does not also meet the version it invented in advance. The village squares where they cultivated this were the same squares where they had lost children, survived wars, buried spouses. Nothing about the location was easier. What was different was this: they were in those squares, present in them, not also rehearsing the next loss while the sun came through the valley at that particular angle and the stone walls held the warmth from the afternoon before. So here is what this means for you, not as an idea to carry forward, but as something you can locate right now in the texture of the next few minutes. There's a version of you that is here, reading this in a specific place with specific sound around it. And there's a version that is already somewhere else, the conversation you haven't had yet, the number you're afraid to check, the outcome you keep running to its worst conclusion. Both versions are technically in the same body, but only one of them has access to the full aperture. Only one of them is available to notice the slightly open door. The centenarians of the Salento corridor didn't find a technique for this. They just never fully closed it. That distinction between recovering an aperture and never habitually narrowing it is where the next part of this story goes. The hands on the linen come back now, not because we saved them for effect, but because what they carried took this long to earn. Last month, researchers at the Italian National Institute of Health released a follow-up analysis of the Salento longevity cluster, the same coastal and inland populations that have drawn demographers and biologists for over a decade. This round of findings did something the earlier studies had not. It attempted to isolate the variable. It failed, deliberately, carefully, with full documentation of the failure. The lead researcher, Dr. Marco Farini, published the negative finding, the absence of a clean cause, as the finding itself. What the data kept returning to, stripped of every confounding variable they could remove, was not a nutrient, not a genetic marker, not a discrete behavior. It was something that showed up in the autonomic nervous system, a relationship with time, specifically a nervous system that had stopped treating the present moment as a rehearsal for threat. That is a biological measurement, not a philosophy. A measurable, observable pattern in tissue and nerve that separates the populations aging slowly from those aging at the rate the models predict. The data is in the journal. The failure to find a simpler answer is the story. There is a researcher at the University of Padua, Dr. Alessandro Coyne, who spent 3 years embedded in a village outside Acciaroli, monitoring heart rate variability in real conditions across real days. Not a lab, not a protocol, actual morning light, actual meals, actual work. What she found was that the oldest residents showed HRV that was not merely high, it was appropriate. It rose and fell in precise correspondence with what was actually happening. Working, it contracted. Resting, it expanded. The nervous system was not bracing for something that hadn't arrived. Younger residents and the researchers themselves showed something different. HRV elevated even at rest, irregular during simple tasks. The body running 2 programs at once, the present one, and a background simulation of everything that might go wrong. Not occasionally, structurally. Coyne noted, without drama, that this pattern appeared to be acquired rather than inherited. The older residents had not been born differently calibrated. Something had happened across decades in the relationship between their attention and their time. Now back to the linen. The fiber in that image, dense, slightly cool, the kind that holds the smell of where it's been stored, cannot be rushed. The thread has memory. Pull too fast and it distorts. Working with it requires meeting it at its own speed, not as discipline, not as meditation, simply as the condition the material imposes, which the hands have accepted without argument. What Coyne's data shows, and what the Farini analysis keeps arriving at from a different direction, is that this quality of contact, attention fully present to what the hands are actually doing, registers in the body as safety. The nervous system reads the tempo of engagement. It reads whether you are here or whether part of you has already left for somewhere else to be afraid. The signal that comes back from that reading shapes what happens next in the tissue. Cellular repair systems that are taxed by future rehearsal get left alone. The body is an honest accountant. It charges for everything you simulate that hasn't happened yet. Moment that asks nothing more of you than your actual presence in it. Something happened last week that most outlets buried under the weight of the week's louder noise. A study out of Kyoto, not a wellness study, not a self-help survey, a hard epidemiological dataset tracking nearly 14,000 adults across a 9-year window, found that the single strongest behavioral predictor of what the researchers called sustained autonomic resilience in adults over 50 was not exercise frequency, not sleep duration, not dietary pattern. It was something the researchers struggled to name precisely, and eventually labeled in their translated abstract as non-instrumental physical engagement with immediate environment during morning waking hours. The phrase is clumsy. What it describes is not. People who, in the first minutes after waking, handled objects without purpose, touched a window frame, stood in early light, held something warm, showed measurably different cardiovascular and neuroendocrine profiles 9 years later than people whose first waking actions were already task-directed. The difference showed up in biological age markers. It showed up in inflammatory load. It showed up in the beat-to-beat variability of the heart. That number your watch is already recording whether you read it or not. Non-instrumental physical engagement. No purpose, just presence. Just hands on something real before the mind has assigned the day its first assignment. This is the Kyoto finding. It will not trend. It does not resolve into a morning protocol you can sell, or a supplement stack, or an app subscription. It resolves into something much older and much harder to monetize. The quality of the first minute. Not the content of the minute, the quality. And now the thing underneath the finding. There are two laws, not metaphors, not motivational frameworks. Laws as in observable principles that appear across disciplines from physics to psychology to the kind of longitudinal data the Kyoto team spent 9 years assembling that help explain what the researchers were actually measuring without realizing it. The first is the law of vibration. Everything that exists is in motion, not poetically, physically, at the level of cells, of atoms, of the electrical signaling between neurons and organs. Nothing is static. What registers as stillness is a frequency. What registers as calm is a frequency. What registers as dread, before you have named it dread, before you have identified a single cause, is also a frequency, and it is legible in the body long before it surfaces in the mind. Heart rate variability is one window into this. The autonomic nervous system's morning baseline is another. The Kyoto researchers were measuring vibration. They called it something else because science requires that language. But they were measuring whether the body was beginning its day in one frequency or another, and finding that the answer had consequences that unfolded across nearly a decade. The second law is the law of attraction, and this is where most people stop listening, because the phrase has been so thoroughly buried under the debris of 1,000 posters and a dozen bestsellers that it no longer sounds like a law. It sounds like wishful thinking, but strip the branding away, and what remains is this. Coherent internal states tend to draw coherent external conditions. Not magically, not without action, but a nervous system that begins the day oriented rather than braced, already registering warmth, already present to its own body, already at a frequency that the Kyoto data associates with resilience. That nervous system makes different decisions, notices different things, responds rather than reacts. Over 9 years, the divergence between those two tracks becomes the difference the researchers found in the data. The laws are not separate. Vibration is the condition. Attraction is the consequence. One precedes the other, and the sequence matters. Tomorrow morning you will make coffee, or someone will have made it, and at some point in the first 20 minutes after waking you will hold a cup with both hands. The ceramic warm against your palms. A smell rising, dark and earthy, something slightly burnt, arriving before you have decided to pay attention to it. That moment is not a protocol. It is not a habit to stack. It is the moment the Kyoto researchers were trying to describe with their clumsy phrase. The moment the two laws are either engaged or missed entirely. The moment the morning autonomic signature is set. For seconds. 60 if you allow 60. The warmth before the thought. The smell before the list. Hands on something real before the mind has claimed the hour. The nervous system does not wait for you to believe in what it is doing. It reads the first signals. Jaw tension, breath rate, whether the shoulders are already raised against something not yet named. And it sets a tone the data suggests echoes forward through the body's regulatory systems for hours. Possibly across enough mornings for years. This is not the Kyoto researchers speculating. This is 9 years of tracking 14,000 people toward a finding that the press release softened into something about lifestyle factors, and most editors passed over entirely because it didn't resolve into an actionable headline. The actionable part is not a headline. It is already in your morning, already in the cup, already in the 4 seconds of warmth and smell that happened before the first sip, before the phone, before the day assembles itself into whatever it is going to demand from you. 1 cup, both hands, the warmth before the thought, the frequency before the plan, non-instrumental physical engagement with immediate environment during morning waking hours. 9 years of data, 2 laws running underneath it without being named. The morning already knows what the research took 9 years to confirm. You're simply being asked to be in it when it happens. There's something about the way a conversation ends that you only notice when you're already missing it. Not when it stops. After. When the room has gone quiet and the particular quality of attention that was passing between 2 people has dissolved back into ordinary air. And you're standing there with a cup of coffee that has gone lukewarm, and you realize you were receiving something you did not have a name for until it was gone. That is the feeling the data kept circling without ever naming it directly. The researchers following the Salento nonagenarians, men and women in their 90s and beyond, living in the hill villages of southern Italy's Campania region, were not looking for a psychological variable when they started. They were looking for the usual suspects: diet, genetics, physical activity, access to healthcare. What they found sitting underneath all of those, running through the variation like a structural beam, was something that did not fit cleanly into any of those categories. A consistent and measurable difference in how the longest-lived individuals process stress events. Not the absence of stress. Not a more fortunate life. A different relationship to the gap between what happened and how the body responded to it. Their cortisol curves were flatter. Their overnight heart rate variability was higher. Their inflammatory markers, particularly C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, stayed lower across the same objective stressors that pushed their age-matched counterparts into acute spikes. And when the researchers sat with them and asked about daily life, the language that came back across different villages and different families and different histories described the same posture: a practiced willingness to let the day be what it was without immediately converting it into a problem requiring urgent resolution. That is not a personality trait. The researchers were specific about this. It was a practice behavior, something done repeatedly over decades until it became structural, until the nervous system had been trained, not metaphorically, but measurably at the level of autonomic regulation, to default to a narrower stress corridor. This is where the law of vibration enters, and it is worth being precise rather than reaching for the kind of language that turns a real mechanism into a bumper sticker. Every cell in the body is in constant electrochemical communication with the systems around it. The state you train yourself to return to repeatedly becomes, over time, the baseline your biology defends. Not through intention alone, through the accumulated weight of repetition. What you rehearse, you become. The Salento data was not documenting exceptional genetics. It was documenting exceptional rehearsal. The law of attraction, stripped of the mysticism people use to sell it, is the same principle applied outward. The attentional posture you maintain determines which signals in your environment you register, which you amplify, and which you filter before they ever reach conscious processing. The nonagenarians were not attracting a calmer world. They were selecting for it, not passively, but through a trained orientation that had, over a lifetime, become the lens. The world they effectively lived in was the one their nervous system had learned to extract from the same raw environment everyone else was standing in. That distinction matters because it removes the magical thinking without removing the mechanism. And the mechanism has a practical edge. It means the pattern is not locked into a particular geography or a particular diet or a particular genetic inheritance. It is available wherever someone decides to practice it with enough consistency that the body starts to register it as a default rather than an exception. That is a harder thing to sell than a supplement. It does not arrive in a bottle. It does not have a before and after photograph. But the Salento data and the broader body of research it sits inside says it is the actual denominator underneath the variation in everything else. The question that follows is the same one that followed all the data that came before it in this conversation. What does practicing that actually look like when you're not in a hill village in southern Italy? When your morning begins with a phone that already has 47 things to say before you have had coffee? When the conditions for sustained attentional calm are not the conditions you happen to be living in? There is no clean answer to that. Anyone who tells you there is a clean answer is selling you the supplement in a different form. What there is instead is the smaller practice of returning repeatedly to the kind of attention that a question like this asks of you. Not the question resolved, the question held. The difference between a mind that metabolizes everything into urgency and a mind that can stay in the presence of something unresolved without the nervous system reading that as emergency. The Salento elders were not people who had solved their lives. They were people who had stopped treating the unsolved portions as evidence of catastrophe. That distinction, repeated 10,000 times across 40 years, shows up in the inflammatory markers. It shows up in the cortisol curves. It shows up in the mortality tables. The next chapter is the last one for today. Before you get there, it is worth sitting for a moment with the fact that none of what the data found required dismantling anything. Not the pace of a working life, not the complexity of a family, not the legitimate weight of the things in the world that are, in fact, heavy. It required only the repeated practice of returning to a narrower corridor. Again and then again after that, until the body stopped treating the return as an effort and started treating it as home. Let's finish this. The hands already knew the answer. Not the researchers, not the clinicians logging intake forms in fluorescent offices, not the epidemiologists staring at cohort data in Bologna and Palermo and the mountain villages above Nuoro. The hands knew first, the way hands always know things before language catches up. The rough pull of linen fiber between thumb and forefinger. The specific weight of salt air settling on skin at 6 in the morning when the water is still dark and the day hasn't decided anything yet. That's what the laboratories are only now beginning to circle. Not the diet, not the sleep architecture, not even the social density of a village where everyone knows your name and your mother's maiden name and the field your grandfather worked before the war. Those things matter. But underneath all of it, something else has been operating, something that doesn't show up cleanly in a blood panel or a grip strength test or an epigenetic clock score. The hands know how to inhabit time, not manage time, not optimize time, not fill time with the right inputs in the right sequence. Inhabit it, the way a person inhabits a room, with their whole body present, with their nervous system not already rehearsing the next room, with their attention actually landing on the texture of what's in front of them. The new Italian data, the Salento cohort, the multi-generational follow-ups out of the University of Naples Federico II, the longevity clusters that don't fit the standard blue zone story because they exist in places without obvious Mediterranean diet purity or exceptional social infrastructure. Those numbers kept pointing back to something the researchers themselves found uncomfortable to name. Not a behavior, a relationship, a specific quality of how a person meets the hours they're given. The linen cartel sits on the table. The smell of salt still in the air. The hands that worked that fiber for 60 years. Hands that cracked in winter and softened in summer. Hands that knew cold water and rough rope and the resistance of a knot pulled tight against weather. Those hands carried something the laboratories have been trying to isolate. And they cannot isolate it because it isn't a compound. It isn't a pathway. It isn't a deficiency you correct. It is a frequency, a sustained, low, coherent frequency of presence. Here is what that means in the body. Not as idea, as event. Every cell, every organ system, every tissue is operating within a range that is either coherent or dysregulated. The cardiac coherence research, the polyvagal data replicated across independent labs, the studies tracking what happens to inflammatory markers and cellular repair rates when the internal signal shifts, all of it points toward the same finding. The quality of your internal state is not a soft variable. It is the organizing signal. It determines what the body recruits, what it repairs, what it accelerates, and what it quietly dismantles. The hands holding the cartel knew this, not as knowledge, as habit. 60 years of returning, without drama, to the weight of the thing in front of them. And when that signal is coherent, not forced into coherence, not performed into it, just allowed to settle the way salt air settles at 6 in the morning, something downstream changes. The information you notice changes. The decisions that come out of you change. The biological processes that either shorten or extend the years you actually feel alive in. They respond to that coherence. The way one string responds when a matching string is plucked across the room. The centenarians in the Salento Hills weren't doing anything esoteric. They were doing something harder and plainer than that. They were meeting the hours without fighting them. Not every hour, not even most hours, but enough. Enough sustained stretches where the body wasn't running a low background simulation of threat on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Enough mornings with salt air and fiber and the specific resistance of work that was simply work. The linen, the rope, the cold water, the knot. Not symbols, just the actual texture of a life where the hands stayed in contact with what was real. And here is where this ends. Not with a protocol, not with a list, not with a morning stack or a number to track. One question, not rhetorical. If what the Italian data is actually mapping is a pattern of how a person inhabits time, not manages it, not optimizes it, inhabits it, then the only variable that changes anything is immediate and unglamorous. How are you going to inhabit the next hour? The 60 minutes after this ends? The first ordinary thing you touch? The temperature of the air on the back of your hands right now, in whatever room you're sitting in, with whatever sound is or isn't moving through it. The cartel of linen, the salt, the hands that worked it for 60 years without knowing they were running an experiment. They weren't trying to live long. They were trying to live. The difference turned out to be everything.